Hello. It's been a while since I've done a video like this, but this is going to be a informal sort of short form lecture about Homestuck and Gnosticism. Now, this is going to be interesting to about 4 or 5 people who are interested in Gnosticism and Homestuck and comparing them. As such, I've decided to make this a, special edition lecture video. So here we go. Gnosticism and Homestuck have a lot in common. And I think this is because of intentional theming, because Andrew Hussey named Jade Garden Gnostic, showing that he knows at least what gnosis means. The concept at play there, he wanted to at least allude to it in some fashion. And also, there are a lot of figures from Gnosticism that are in Homestuck. For instance, Yeldaboth and Abraxas are both denizens in the medium. Yeldaboth, critically, is Cal's denizen. What I'm saying here is a lot of my topics are very tenuous, but this one is more warranted than usual, right? I'm making a comparison that I think was intentionally supposed to be made by the reader. So what is Gnosticism? Well, to understand Gnosticism, you have to understand the root word gnosis. In the most sort of broad meaning, gnosis means spiritual enlightenment, and Gnosticism was the... it's hard to call it an offshoot of Christianity because it was so intertwined with Christianity. This is not a history lesson, so I'm just going to say it was a Christian offshoot that prioritized different things than normal Christianity and had very different ideas about the nature of God, right? You see this sort of Judeo-Christian tradition, and you might think of God, and you might think of the Trinity, or you might think of sort of the Godhead or something like that. But in Gnosticism, there's something else at play. Gnostics noticed that there was a big difference between the God that existed in the Old Testament and the God that Jesus spoke of. And the Christians sort of explained this difference by saying, okay, well, God is actually many aspects, and he was only showing some aspects during the New Testament, and he showed different aspects during the Old Testament. And Gnostics say something completely different. That, no, these are not the same God at all. In fact, the God of the Old Testament is an evil God called the Demiurge, or Yeldaboth. Yeldaboth, I don't really know how to say that. There's a big vowel cluster in that word. If you've seen it, you know. I will be saying it Yeldaboth, and if that pisses you off, then make sure to leave an angry comment. Anyway, so with this, you see the idea of Christ also changing his goals. In Christianity, we understand Christ to be a redeemer figure, right? He died for our sins. You've heard that before. In Gnosticism, he was more of a very psychological enlightener. He wanted to bring enlightenment to people. And there's not as much emphasis on his godhood, and there's not as much emphasis on his sacrifice. And there's a lot of different gospels that the Gnostics talk about in terms of Jesus, and they have a lot to say about Jesus, but that's not really the purview of this video. What I'm saying is, Gnosticism is the idea of enlightenment in a very specific sense, a spiritual enlightenment or a physical enlightenment, not just a faith like a Christian might say, but Gnostics were concerned with this idea of gnosis. So the main Gnostic idea that is invoked in Homestuck is the idea of the Demiurge. Like I said before, the Gnostics had this idea of the Old Testament God being a sort of aborted God that, or they call him the created creator, which is fucked up and weird. And this is an oversimplification greatly, but they essentially believe that there is a God out there who has dominion over the earth, who is nefarious and evil. And that is why evil exists in the world, and badness and corruption and whatnot. And you can kind of compare this to other monotheistic religions of sort of the ancient world. For instance, Zoroastrianism had this idea of the light god and the dark god, whose names escape me. But Gnosticism had this idea of the demiurge, this god who is the boss of reality, but also kind of a dickhead. Again, that's an oversimplification. If you've played Persona 5, you've seen the demiurge invoked. Now, the demiurge, as used in Persona 5, is not quite the same. And the demiurge, as he exists in Homestuck, Yeldaboth, that's his name, Yeldaboth, is invoked also, but he's not really the demiurge of Homestuck. So we're going to separate this idea of Yeldaboth and the demiurge, because I think it's kind of, in Homestuck at least, a separated concept. Yeldaboth is the name of Cal's denizen, as I said before, but the demiurge Yeldaboth is not that denizen. It is Caliborn, the result of communion with Yeldaboth, with that denizen. Yeldaboth bestows Caliborn with ultimate power. And this ultimate power is very explicitly, not good. He is the antagonist of the story. He is the demiurge of Homestuck. A lot of the things that people have to do in Homestuck are direct consequences and causes of Caliborn. He needs a lot of stuff to be in place for his stupid little plans to work. And, that's a big old problem for the characters, because they don't really like Cal because he wrecks everything up. He is the demiurge. He is this evil god who has dominion over reality, who keeps their subjects in reality, and kind of just, the subjects of the reality do not have the tools to face him. It's kind of like if you made a video game and all the characters became self-aware, they would really have no way to defy you, because you are their creator and they are trapped inside of the world of the game. They are lines of code. They cannot harm you. They might be able to, hurt your feelings or something by yelling and screaming at you, but they have no way to kill you. Now, Gnosis, they believed, these Gnostics, was a way to escape this idea of this evil god. And in Homestuck, we see a very specific depiction of Gnosis happening. And it's obviously through John, who finds the Juju, and he makes this means to defy Cal. And very critically, even though a lot of people are present when John touches the Juju to become this, increased in power, he is the only one who actually goes through with it, right? John is the Christ-like figure of Homestuck. And he's not Christ-like in a traditional Christian sense where you're talking about sacrifice and divinity. I mean, he is a god, but God in Homestuck does not mean like a divine person. He is a Christ figure in the Gnostic sense, like I was talking about before, in the sense of, okay, he's going to help you become enlightened. And he does. He actually brings in Roxy as a disciple to help him on his quest. Terezi is also helping him on the thing, even though she dies pretty early on in their shtick. But through this act of retconning the timeline, he is able to undo some of the influence of the demiurge, enough to where he and his friends can regroup and kind of kick his ass. And the disciple that he brings in, Roxy, becomes his equal, which was also a Gnostic idea. This Gnostic idea was like, okay, Christianity would say, you cannot become like Christ because Christ is like God and you are not God. You are God's creation. But Gnostics would say something more like, no, you can totally become like God. In fact, you should aspire to this. You should aspire to Gnosis. You should do that. And a lot of early Christians found this incredibly heretical. And again, this is not a history lesson, but this is not compatible with Christianity, even though this is kind of two perspectives on one Christ-like figure. And only after they are able to undo the influence of this demiurge figure, Caliborn, do John and his friends go to salvation. And very critically, John is this Christ-like figure, but his salvation is for everybody. He's not a savior figure, even though I use the word salvation there. He is a figure who, he does not say, okay, I'm going to die for your sins. I'm going to die because you are, tainted in some way, and my death will untaint you. John is saying, I want to bring everyone to heaven now. And this idea of the Christ in that sense is very interesting, because we don't see depictions of that. We Christ figures in media often are so mired in sort of sacrifice and divinity that we don't see someone actually working selflessly for enlightenment, both psychologically, physically, and everything else. In fact, as what we see of Earthsea in not just Homestuck, but also the epilogues, it seems to be sort of this post-scarcity paradise, right? I mean, everything's not perfect in the epilogues, but even then, the conflict does not surround okay, who's getting enough food? It's surrounding the psychological damage that these characters faced. So Earthsea is this new plane of existence. It's a higher plane where people can work out their troubles and not have to worry about mundane things like, the demiurge coming and killing all the fucking horror terrors. And, I just think that's interesting, drawing those conclusions. Now, the conclusions are fine and dandy. I can draw conclusions all day long. I can, draw lines between two pieces of literature or two ideas. But what's the point? The point is sort of what we can learn from Caliborn in a spiritual way. The utility of having an evil god. And what I mean by this is not like why would you want an evil god? It is more like the function of an evil god in your spirituality, right? An evil god, a demiurge, someone you can kind of target as the source of your problems. This is very good for you psychologically. And Caliborn represents this very, not just time, oppression, and all these other things that he does, and double death, but also this very basic misogyny and fuckboyness that he exemplifies through his Cal persona, or Caliborn persona rather. And we kind of want to defeat him because he reads as an asshole. And he's still God, and God is still an asshole, and there is a great utility in this idea of God as the asshole. An evil God is an interesting philosophical tool. Evil God means there is some force that you can defeat in the world, that there is some quest that you can embark on that is not tied to some kind of specific conditions, right? You are not just embarking on a quest to fuck over Caliborn, this guy who's an asshole. Your quest is also to rid the world of his influence, and that's very admirable. Or let's say, your personal demiurge is the idea of man-spreading or something. I don't know. The idea of misogyny, this idea of consumerism. This is your evil god. This is the god that people mistakenly worship. This is the god that traps people in the Matrix, the god that you can see because you have achieved this kind of gnosis. And again, this is not strictly a Gnostic thing, what I'm saying here. This is more of a meta, I don't know what you would call this, meta theology, I don't know. The idea of an evil god being something that you can sort of selectively choose, something that you can identify in the world. Evil god is very common, in fact, spiritually. It is kind of something that the human mind is drawn to. This is why in Christian tradition there is no evil deity, right? It's only God. He is the only God. He says that about 1 million fucking times in the various Gospels, especially in the New Testament. He is the only God. He has many facets, but he is the only God. That is it. And even though this is something that is reiterated over and over in Christian texts, there's still an idea of the devil or the Satan that prevails in Christianity. And Gnosticism doesn't really need that because it just says, well, no, the demiurge is the one who's the evil one. Satan is like a different thing. But very critically, evil God sort of turns you on to something that I think is very, very critical that traditional spirituality entirely lacks. If you only have a good God, if you only have a positivistic God, if you have a God that is like, okay, I want to achieve this is a positivistic, then you kind of only have faith. Like the only aspirational thing you can do is just to be more like God, which is, it's compelling to a lot of people, but to me personally, I've never really related to that struggle, right? I think that Christianity has to bake in a lot of like shame to actually make you want to have faith in a God who loves you. It has to bake in this idea of original sin. It has to bake in the idea of like Jesus dying for you to make you think, okay, I need to be ashamed of something, so I need to follow this God and I need to be more like him. An evil God, a negativistic God, something that you want to defeat, it gives your spirituality an end point that good God does not, right? Because Christianity, they'll tell you, you can never be God. You can never be perfect. Perfection does not exist. It is an illusion. And with an evil God, the opposite is true. That there is an end point. There is a defeatable element to this, right? If my personal demiurge is, maybe it's the idea of dirty dishes. Well, I can actually, fight against that in some way. I can clean my dishes, and that has an end point. And an end point is very psychologically satisfying because the human mind is kind of not built to be an entirely spiritual machine. Like, there's a lot of mundanity that has to go on. So if you get the sort of, again, I'm phrasing this in kind of very mundane or very colloquial terms, but I really do mean this. If you have an end point to your sort of personal quest, or if you have an end point to your notion of evil, then that's very psychologically satisfying, especially if you can achieve that. I think another part that a good God does not have is this idea of like, okay, if God is perfectly good and God knows all and God is, wonderful and perfect and he loves us all, why is there evil in the world? That's a very difficult question to ask, and in fact, there's an entire sect of theology devoted to it, which is apologetics. Why? Why does God allow there to be evil if he loves us? Why does God allow people to, not believe in him? And these questions are just kind of non-issues for those who believe in this demiurge, this evil God. And in fact, those same questions of like, why is there evil in the world? Not only do they have an answer, but they have action items, right? Like, if all you do is apologetics, if all you say is, well, we don't know why God allows evil in the world, or God allows evil in the world to test us, or something like that, then that's kind of like, that's not very satisfying. No answer that they reach will be satisfying. It can be logical, it can have logos, but it cannot have pathos or ethos. On the other hand, if you say, well, God is like evil, he'll fuck you over, so that's why evil exists in the world, then that kind of just says, okay, well, fine. Then there's evil in the world. And the goodness that I feel is all the more impactful because I am triumphing over this evil God, this demiurge. And I think that's probably what the kids of Homestuck feel when they overcome Caliborn, when they feel fighting back against him, even though they don't actually interact with him much outside of John. I mean, he beats the shit out of Caliborn. That's very psychologically satisfying, even if it doesn't achieve any goal. He is achieving just like, beating up a fuckboy, essentially. And I think an evil God has more potential to reshape the world than a good God. And I just enjoy the idea of Gnosticism a lot. I don't know. I kind of lost steam at the end there, but I think you get what I was saying. If you want to know more about Gnosticism, and you don't just want to hear me prattle on about like how it relates to Homestuck, then there's two resources. One is free and one is a book. The free resource is Intro to Gnosticism by Blazing Star OTO on YouTube. It's about an hour and a half long lecture on sort of just basic Gnostic concepts, how it relates with Christianity, etc. And there's also Intro to Gnosis by Samael on Weor. I don't know how to spell that. SamaelAunweor. That's the name. And that's also an interesting resource. These are just introductory texts. These will probably lead you to more stuff. But at the end of the day, Gnosticism is fascinating to me. So I wanted to talk about it with relation to Homestuck because I think there are a lot of overlaps. If you know about Gnosticism, excuse me, I'm yawning. If you know about Gnosticism and there's something I didn't mention or something you might want to bring up, because this is not a definitive thing, right? I'm not saying that this is the be-all, end-all discussion of comparing Gnosticism to Homestuck. So I do want feedback. Put it in the comments if you have any ideas how concepts relate to each other. That's about it, though. I'm going to end this abruptly right now.